The Arizona sun was already merciless by mid-morning when Samuel Porter walked the irrigation ditch that represented his farm's lifeline and his family's hope for survival. The year was 1878, and Sam had spent 4 years trying to prove that the desert land everyone had told him was worthless could support a family if worked with enough determination and faith. So far, determination and faith hadn't been sufficient substitutes for adequate water and fertile soil, but Sam refused to give up on the dream that had brought him and his wife Emma to this harsh territory with their 2 young children. The figure collapsed near the irrigation ditch caught Sam's attention. As he was checking for leaks and blockages that could waste precious water, at first he thought it might be an animal seeking water, but as he approached, he realized it was a child, a Native American boy, perhaps 10 years old, lying motionless in the sparse shade of a palo verde tree. Sam's heart jumped as he knelt beside the boy, checking for signs of life and finding a weak pulse and shallow breathing that suggested severe dehydration complicated by some other injury. Sam carefully examined the boy and discovered the source of his distress. The child's left leg was swollen and clearly causing intense pain, probably from a bad sprain or possibly a fracture that had been left untreated for several days. The boy had apparently been trying to reach the water in Sam's irrigation ditch before collapsing from a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and pain. Without hesitation, Sam lifted the small figure in his arms and began walking back toward his modest adobe farmhouse, calling out to Emma as he approached. Emma Porter had learned during their 4 years in Arizona that survival on the frontier required quick action and practical compassion rather than lengthy deliberation. She immediately set about preparing a place for the boy to rest, while Sam brought water and the simple medical supplies they kept for treating injuries common to farm life. Together they carefully cleaned the boy's injured leg and discovered that while it was badly sprained and bruised, it didn't appear to be broken. The swelling and discoloration suggested the injury was several days old, and the boy had been walking on it far longer than he should have. As Sam worked to bandage the injured leg, he noticed something that made him pause and look more closely. On the boy's right forearm was a distinctive mark, a pattern of lines and symbols that was clearly not a natural birthmark or accidental scar. The design was deliberate and intricate, consisting of geometric patterns that seemed to represent water flowing through channels, with additional symbols that Sam couldn't interpret, but which clearly held meaning. The mark had been made with some kind of permanent pigment or dye, embedded in the skin in a way that suggested both artistry and sacred purpose. The boy's eyes opened as Sam finished bandaging his leg, and despite obvious pain and exhaustion, he looked at Sam and Emma with clear intelligence and careful evaluation. When Sam pointed to himself and said Sam, the boy understood immediately and responded Kaylee, touching his own chest. The child's English was limited, but his understanding seemed deeper than his vocabulary allowed him to express. When Sam gently touched the mark on Kaylee's arm and raised his eyebrows in question, the boy's expression became serious, and he spoke a single word in what Sam assumed was Apache, Tohono, which he would later learn meant keeper or guardian. Over the rest of that day, as Kaylee alternated between sleeping and accepting small amounts of food and water, Sam found himself repeatedly thinking about the mark on the boy's arm and what it might signify. He'd lived in Arizona long enough to know that native peoples had complex cultural practices and that certain marks or symbols could indicate status, family lineage, or sacred responsibilities within tribal communities. But there was something about this particular mark that suggested it represented more than just identity, something that carried weight and meaning beyond what Sam understood about native customs. Emma, with her practical nature and experience raising their own children, focused on nursing Kaylee back to health rather than puzzling over the significance of marks and symbols. She prepared simple meals that wouldn't upset the boy's weakened stomach, kept water available for frequent small drinks, and watched for signs of fever or infection that could complicate recovery from his injuries. Their own children, 6-year-old Martha and 4-year-old James, watched the proceedings with wide-eyed curiosity, never having seen a native child up close and fascinated by this unexpected visitor to their isolated farm. By evening, as the desert heat began to moderate and Sam sat on his porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He reflected on how a simple act of compassion had brought this mysterious child into his home. He had no idea yet that helping Keely would lead to revelations about the land he'd been struggling to farm, or that the mark on the boy's arm identified him as an apprentice to knowledge that could transform Sam's failing operation into something remarkable. All Sam knew was that a child had needed help, and providing that help was simply what decent people did regardless of cultural differences or the economic pressures that made every resource precious on the Arizona frontier. The questions about who Keely was, where he'd come from, and why he'd been traveling alone with an injured leg would wait for morning. For now the boy was safe, fed and resting comfortably in the Porter household, and Sam felt the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing, even when he could barely afford to feed his own family, let alone take in another mouth to support. He had no way of knowing that this decision would be repaid 100-fold through knowledge that would change everything about how he understood the desert land he'd been trying so desperately to make productive. Cale's recovery over the next week revealed qualities that impressed both Sam and Emma with their depth and maturity. Despite being only 10 years old, the boy showed a careful awareness of his surroundings and a respectful manner that suggested he'd been raised with strong cultural training. As his leg healed and he began to move around the farm with increasing confidence, Cale started observing Sam's agricultural practices with obvious interest, occasionally making gestures or sounds that seemed to indicate he wanted to communicate something important about what he was seeing. The breakthrough in communication came when Sam was working on his irrigation system, trying to figure out why certain sections of his field were producing better crops than others, despite receiving what appeared to be equal amounts of water. Cale watched for several minutes, then approached and pointed to areas of the field where Sam's crops were struggling, making flowing gestures with his hands and speaking words in Apache that Sam couldn't understand. Frustrated by the language barrier, Cale picked up a stick and began drawing in the dirt near the irrigation ditch, creating patterns that looked remarkably similar to the mark on his arm. Sam knelt beside the boy and watched as Cale drew a simplified version of the irrigation system, then added lines indicating something beneath the surface that Sam hadn't previously considered. The boy was trying to explain that water didn't just flow through the irrigation ditch, but also moved underground through soil layers that could be influenced by how the surface channels were arranged. Cale's drawing suggested that Sam's irrigation pattern was fighting against the natural underground flow rather than working with it, causing some areas to receive too much water while others remained too dry, despite being connected to the same ditch system. The complexity of what Cale was trying to communicate became clearer when the boy led Sam to different areas of the field and began pointing out subtle details that the farmer had never noticed. Certain plants grew more vigorously in specific locations, not just because of the obvious irrigation, but because underground moisture was pooling there based on soil composition and underlying rock formations. Other areas that Sam had been trying to irrigate heavily were actually suffering because the water was draining too quickly through porous soil layers, carrying away nutrients before crops could absorb them properly. Emma watched these interactions with growing fascination, recognizing that Cale possessed knowledge about desert agriculture that went far beyond what their family had learned through trial and error. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table with the children, Emma suggested they try to find someone who could translate more effectively between Cale's Apache and their English. Sam agreed, but before they could make plans to visit the trading post where translators sometimes gathered, Cale surprised them by producing a small leather pouch he'd been carrying when Sam found him. Inside the pouch were objects that explained much about who Cale was and why the mark on his arm carried such significance. There were seeds from native plants that Sam had never considered cultivating, small stones with particular colors and textures that Cale used to explain different soil types, and most remarkably, a piece of birch bark covered with intricate drawings that represented a map of water sources and seasonal flow patterns across a large section of southern Arizona. The map included symbols that clearly related to the mark on Cale's arm, suggesting that the pattern wasn't just identification, but also a key to understanding a complex system of environmental knowledge. Through patient repetition, gestures and drawings over the following days, Kaylee began teaching Sam the basics of what he was calling tohono knowledge, the waterkeeper traditions that his people had developed over generations of living successfully in the harsh Arizona desert. The mark on Kaylee's arm identified him as an apprentice who was learning this sacred knowledge from elders who had mastered the art of understanding how water moved through the landscape, how different plants indicated various soil conditions, and how seasonal patterns could be predicted by observing natural signs that most people never noticed. Sam was astonished to learn that Kaylee, despite his young age, had already spent years training to become a waterkeeper, learning to read the desert in ways that made Sam's 4 years of struggling seem like mere fumbling in the dark. The boy could predict where underground water would be found by observing the health and distribution of certain plant species, could determine optimal planting times by watching the behavior of insects and birds, and understood soil composition in ways that went far beyond simply categorizing dirt as sandy or clayey. The question that began to occupy Sam's thoughts was why Kaylee had been traveling alone with an injured leg when he clearly came from a community that valued him highly enough to train him in this sacred knowledge. When Sam gently asked about Kaylee's family through gestures and the few Apache words he was learning, the boy's expression became sad, and he indicated through pantomime that he had been sent away from his community to escape some kind of danger. The details remained unclear due to the language barrier, but Sam understood that Kaylee couldn't immediately return home and that the boy's presence at his farm wasn't a temporary situation, but rather a form of refuge from circumstances that weren't entirely explained. Emma, always practical about such matters, pointed out that whatever had brought Kaylee to their farm, they were now responsible for his well-being and should focus on learning whatever he could teach them while ensuring he felt safe and valued. The knowledge Kaylee was beginning to share about desert agriculture could be the difference between their farm's success or failure, but more importantly, the boy himself deserved their care and protection, regardless of any practical benefits his presence might bring. As Sam lay awake that night, thinking about the mark on Kaylee's arm and the depth of knowledge it represented, he began to understand that he'd been given an extraordinary gift through his simple act of helping an injured child. The waterkeeper traditions that Kaylee was beginning to reveal weren't just agricultural techniques, but rather a complete philosophy about how to live in harmony with a challenging environment, understanding and respecting natural systems rather than trying to dominate them through brute force and unsustainable practices. The question was whether Sam could learn quickly enough to save his struggling farm, and whether accepting this knowledge would create obligations and responsibilities that extended beyond simple agricultural improvement. The changes to Sam's farm began subtly, but accumulated quickly once Kaylee started actively guiding modifications to the irrigation system and planting arrangements. The boy's suggestions seemed simple at first, slightly changing the angle of certain water channels, relocating crops by just a few feet, adding native plants that Sam had previously considered worthless weeds to specific locations around the field. But the cumulative effect of these small adjustments was remarkable, with sections of the farm that had barely produced enough to justify the effort suddenly showing vigorous growth and healthy crops. Sam's neighbors began to notice the transformation, particularly those who had been sympathetic to his struggles, but skeptical about his chances of making his marginal land productive. Within 2 months of implementing Kaylee's guidance, Sam's field showed more green growth than anyone had seen there in the 4 years he'd been working the property. The corn that had previously grown stunted and sparse was now reaching respectable heights. The beans were producing actual yields rather than barely surviving. And most remarkably, native plants that Kaylee had introduced were thriving in areas where Sam's imported crops had consistently failed. The key to understanding what Kaylee was teaching came when Sam finally grasped that the waterkeeper traditions weren't about forcing the desert to become something it wasn't, but rather about understanding what the desert naturally wanted to support and working within those patterns. Instead of trying to grow crops that required constant irrigation and fought against the local climate, Kaylee was showing him how to cultivate plants that were adapted to desert conditions, but could still provide food, medicine, and materials useful for human communities. The irrigation system wasn't being used to artificially sustain unsuitable crops, but rather to supplement and enhance what the land could naturally support. Emma's practical contributions to implementing Kayleigh's teachings proved invaluable as she translated the boys' agricultural wisdom into approaches that fit within their family's daily routines and limited resources. She learned which native plants produced edible seeds or roots that could supplement their diet, discovered which herbs had medicinal properties useful for treating common ailments, and identified materials that could be used for everything from basket making to natural dyes. The farm was becoming not just more productive, but more diverse and resilient, less dependent on the success or failure of any single crop. The children, Martha and James, took to Kayleigh as if he were a brother, learning from him with the natural enthusiasm of young minds unburdened by preconceptions about what was possible or proper. Martha particularly enjoyed learning about the different plants and their properties, while James was fascinated by Kayleigh's ability to predict weather patterns by observing cloud formations, wind directions, and animal behavior. The Porter household was transforming from a struggling, frontier family into students of environmental knowledge that most settlers never accessed. The first real test of Kayleigh's teachings came when a neighbor named Douglas Harding visited Sam's farm to see what everyone had been talking about regarding the remarkable improvements. Harding owned significantly more land than Sam and had the capital to invest in more extensive irrigation systems and imported agricultural supplies. But his yields were still disappointing relative to his investment. Seeing Sam's transformed farm made Harding both impressed and troubled, leading to questions about how such improvements had been achieved on such marginal land with such limited resources. Sam faced a dilemma in how to answer Harding's questions. He could credit Kayleigh and the waterkeeper knowledge the boy was sharing, which would raise questions about who Kayleigh was and why he was staying with the Porter family. Or Sam could attribute the improvements to his own experimentation and learning, which would be dishonest, but would protect Kayleigh from attention that might not be welcome, given the boy's unclear circumstances. In the moment, Sam chose a middle path, acknowledging that he'd received advice from someone knowledgeable about desert agriculture but not providing details that would identify Kayleigh or explain the source of his unusual expertise. Harding's visit and his obvious interest in learning Sam's secrets made Kayleigh visibly uncomfortable, and that evening the boy tried to communicate something important through gestures and the growing vocabulary of English words he was acquiring. The knowledge Kayleigh was sharing, Sam came to understand, wasn't meant to be kept secret for selfish reasons, but rather was traditionally passed through specific lines and to people who had been trained to understand both the techniques and the responsibilities that came with them. Sharing waterkeeper knowledge carelessly could lead to it being misused or misunderstood, potentially harming both the land and the communities that depended on it. This revelation forced Sam to think carefully about his obligations regarding the knowledge Kayleigh was teaching him. Was he meant to keep it private, using it only for his own family's benefit, while his neighbors continued to struggle with desert agriculture? Should he try to share Kayleigh's teachings more broadly, even though he himself was still learning the principles and might not understand the deeper wisdom behind specific practices? Or was there some middle path that would allow the knowledge to benefit his community while still respecting the sacred trust that Kayleigh's people had placed in waterkeepers who carried the distinctive mark? The complexity of these questions deepened when Sam began to recognize patterns in Kayleigh's teachings that suggested the waterkeeper traditions weren't just about agricultural techniques, but rather represented a complete philosophy about human relationships with the natural world. The mark on Kayleigh's arm, Sam realized, identified the boy as part of a lineage that had preserved ecological wisdom through generations, maintaining understanding of how different aspects of desert ecosystems interacted and how human activities could either support or undermine natural balance. As Sam's farm continued to improve, and word of his success spread through the struggling farming community, he understood that he was reaching a turning point where he would need to make decisions about how to honor the gift Kayleigh had given him while also responding to the needs of neighbors who were facing the same challenges that had nearly defeated his own farming efforts. The mark on Kayleigh's arm had come to represent not just the boy's identity as a waterkeeper apprentice, but also a burden of responsibility that Sam was beginning to share simply by learning what that mark signified and by accepting the knowledge it represented. The moment Sam had been dreading came 6 weeks after Keely's arrival, when 2 Apache men appeared at his farm, asking about a boy who matched Keely's description. Sam's initial fear that they might be pursuing Kel with hostile intent faded quickly when he saw the obvious relief in their faces upon learning the boy was safe and recovering. The elder of the 2 men, who introduced himself through limited English as Nantan, was clearly a person of importance within his community, and the respectful way he spoke Kele's name suggested deep concern rather than anger. Through a combination of Kele's improving English, Nantan's limited English vocabulary, and extensive use of gestures and drawings, Sam learned the circumstances that had brought Kele to his irrigation ditch with an injured leg. The boy had been traveling with other waterkeepers to a gathering where knowledge was shared between different communities. But their group had been disrupted by aggressive settlers who had been harassing native travelers throughout the region. In the confusion of avoiding confrontation, Kele had become separated from his companions, injured his leg while trying to evade pursuit, and had been trying to reach a known water source when he collapsed near Sam's farm. Nantan's explanation of what Kele represented to his community made Sam understand for the first time the full significance of the mark on the boy's arm and why his disappearance had caused such concern. Waterkeepers weren't just individuals who knew agricultural techniques, but rather living repositories of collective wisdom that had been accumulated over countless generations. The training to become a waterkeeper began in childhood and continued throughout a person's life, involving not just practical skills, but also ceremonial knowledge, historical understanding, and spiritual practices that connected environmental stewardship to deeper cultural values. The loss of even one waterkeeper, especially a promising young apprentice like Kele, represented potential loss of knowledge that couldn't be easily recovered or replaced. Nantan explained that there were fewer waterkeepers in each generation, partly because the training was demanding, and not everyone had the aptitude, but also because the disruptions of forced relocations, disease, and conflicts with settlers had broken many of the traditional transmission paths. Kele's mark identified him as one of the last in a lineage that possessed specific knowledge about water sources in the region where Sam's farm was located. What Nantan said next surprised Sam completely. The elder acknowledged and expressed gratitude for Sam's care of Kele, but instead of immediately taking the boy back to his community, Nantan proposed something unexpected. He had observed Sam's farm during his approach and had recognized that Kele had been teaching the waterkeeper traditions to his rescuer. This sharing of sacred knowledge was unusual and technically violated protocols about how such wisdom should be transmitted, but Nantan suggested that perhaps Kele's presence at Sam's farm and his decision to teach weren't accidents but rather represented an opportunity that should be honored rather than dismissed. The proposal Nantan outlined over the next several hours was both generous and demanding. Kele could remain with the Porter family for an extended period, continuing to teach Sam about waterkeeper practices and helping transform the farm into a demonstration of what the desert could support when treated with understanding and respect. In exchange, Sam would need to accept responsibilities that went beyond simply improving his own property. He would need to share what he learned appropriately with other settlers who were struggling to farm in Arizona, helping them understand sustainable approaches while also teaching them to respect the native peoples whose knowledge made such success possible. Sam found himself facing a decision that would determine not just his farm's future, but his entire family's role in the complex cultural landscape of the Arizona Territory. Accepting Nantan's proposal meant becoming a bridge between settler and native agricultural traditions, taking on the responsibility of representing waterkeeper wisdom to people who had often viewed native knowledge as primitive superstition rather than sophisticated environmental understanding. It meant advocating for approaches that might seem strange or impractical to neighbors who believed progress required dominating nature rather than working with it. Emma's perspective, shared during a private conversation, after Nantan had departed to report Kaylee's location to others who had been searching for him, helped Sam understand the moral dimensions of the choice he faced. They had helped Kaylee simply because it was right to help an injured child, not expecting any particular benefit or compensation. The knowledge the boy had shared had already transformed their farm and secured their family's future in ways they couldn't have achieved through their own efforts. The question wasn't whether they owed something for this gift, but rather whether they were the right people to take on the larger responsibility of serving as cultural translators and advocates for sustainable practices. Sam's decision came from understanding that the mark on Kaylee's arm represented something he'd come to value, more than personal prosperity, wisdom about how to live successfully in a challenging environment without exhausting the resources that sustained life. His 4 years of struggling to force the desert to produce crops it couldn't naturally support had taught him that his original approach was fundamentally flawed. Kaylee had shown him that there was another way, one that worked with natural patterns rather than against them, and that this alternative approach wasn't just more effective but more honest about human limitations and environmental realities. The agreement Sam reached with Nantan and, through him, with the broader network of waterkeepers, established a framework for an unprecedented collaboration. Sam's farm would become what Nantan called a teaching place, where both native and settler agricultural practices could be demonstrated, and where people from different communities could learn to see the desert not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as an environment that offered abundance to those who understood its patterns and respected its limits. Kaylee would remain with the Porter family as long as his apprenticeship allowed, not as their servant or dependent, but as their teacher and guide in understanding the land they were trying to work. But the agreement also included warnings about challenges Sam would face as he took on this role. Not all settlers would welcome being told that their agricultural approaches were unsustainable, or that they needed to learn from native peoples they'd been taught to view as obstacles to progress. Not all native communities would be comfortable with sacred knowledge being shared with outsiders, even when that sharing was authorized by waterkeeper elders. Sam was being asked to occupy a difficult position between cultures that had often been in conflict, serving as an advocate for approaches that challenged assumptions held by both groups. As Sam looked at the mark on Kaylee's arm that evening, seeing it now with full understanding of what it represented and what responsibilities he was taking on, by accepting the knowledge it signified, he felt the weight of the decision he'd made. His life would never be the same, not because of personal wealth or success, but because he'd been given the privilege of learning how to see the desert through eyes that understood its deeper patterns and honored its complex beauty. The limping boy he'd found by his irrigation ditch had brought him not just agricultural wisdom, but a calling to serve, as a bridge between ways of knowing that both had value and both were necessary for creating sustainable human communities in the challenging landscape of the Arizona frontier. 1 year after Sam had found Kaylee collapsed by his irrigation ditch, the transformation of the Porter farm had become impossible for the local community to ignore. What had once been marginal land that barely supported a struggling family was now a productive operation that grew diverse crops using a fraction of the water that neighboring farms required. More remarkably, the farm had become a gathering place where people from both settler and native communities came to learn about agricultural approaches that bridged traditional waterkeeper wisdom with practical adaptations suited to frontier living conditions. Sam's role as a teacher of sustainable desert agriculture had developed gradually, beginning with cautious conversations with struggling neighbors who wanted to understand how his yields had improved so dramatically. Emma had proven invaluable in these teaching efforts, particularly in showing settler women how native plants could supplement their families' diets and provide materials for household needs. The Porter children, now thoroughly educated in both settler and waterkeeper traditions, thanks to Kaylee's ongoing presence, served as living demonstrations that cultural knowledge could be successfully combined, rather than seeing different traditions as competitors. Kaylee himself had grown during his year with the Porter family, both physically and in his mastery of English, and understanding of how to communicate waterkeeper knowledge to people who hadn't been raised within that tradition. The boy's leg had healed completely, and his continued choice to remain with Sam's family rather than immediately returning to his community reflected both the bonds he'd formed with the porters and his recognition that his presence served an important purpose in building understanding between cultures that needed to learn from each other. The most significant achievement of the year had been the establishment of what Sam and Nantan called the Desert Teaching Garden, a section of land where different approaches to desert agriculture were demonstrated side by side. Traditional native crops grew alongside adapted settler vegetables, irrigated using methods that combined waterkeeper understanding of natural flow patterns with practical engineering that settlers could implement with available tools and materials. The garden had become a regular gathering place where farmers, native families, and occasionally even territorial officials came to observe techniques that were producing results that challenged prevailing assumptions about what desert land could support. The success of the teaching garden had attracted attention that went beyond simple agricultural interest, bringing both opportunities and challenges that tested Sam's commitment to honoring the responsibilities he'd accepted when agreeing to serve as a bridge between cultures. Land speculators recognized that if Sam's techniques could make marginal desert land productive, property values throughout the territory might shift dramatically. Government agricultural agents saw potential for developing policies that could make more desert land available for settlement. Some native communities viewed the teaching garden as inappropriate sharing of sacred knowledge, while others saw it as a necessary adaptation to circumstances where traditional transmission methods were being disrupted by forced relocations and cultural upheaval. The crisis that forced Sam to confront the complexities of his position came when a wealthy rancher named Cyrus Whitmore offered to purchase his farm for a price that would make the Porter family financially secure for generations. Whitmore's stated intention was to expand the teaching garden concept across thousands of acres, creating a large-scale demonstration of waterkeeper principles that could transform Arizona agriculture. The offer was tempting, especially given the economic insecurity that still worried Sam despite his improved harvests, but accepting it would mean surrendering control over how Cayley's teachings were used and potentially commercializing knowledge that had been shared in trust. Sam's deliberations about Whitmore's offer forced him to return to fundamental questions about what the mark on Cayley's arm truly represented and what obligations he'd taken on by learning what it signified. The waterkeeper traditions weren't just agricultural techniques to be exploited for profit, but rather expressions of a philosophical relationship with the natural world that emphasized stewardship over exploitation, long-term sustainability over short-term gain, and community well-being over individual accumulation. Accepting Whitmore's offer would provide financial security, but would betray the principles that made the teachings valuable in the first place. Cayley's perspective on the situation proved decisive in Sam's thinking. Through their conversations, which now occurred easily in English, supplemented by the shared agricultural vocabulary they'd developed, the boy explained that waterkeeper knowledge was meant to be shared, but that how it was shared mattered enormously. Teaching people to understand and respect desert ecosystems honored the traditions his people had maintained for generations, using that knowledge simply to make more land available for exploitation that would ultimately exhaust resources dishonored everything waterkeepers stood for. The solution Sam proposed to Whitmore represented a compromise that attempted to honor both the potential value of expanding sustainable agriculture and the need to preserve the ethical framework that made waterkeeper teachings meaningful. Instead of selling his farm, Sam offered to help establish additional teaching gardens on various properties throughout the territory, serving as a consultant who could guide implementation while ensuring that the underlying principles of sustainability and respect were maintained. This approach would spread the benefits of the knowledge without concentrating control in ways that might lead to exploitation. Whitmore's rejection of this alternative revealed what Sam had suspected about the rancher's true motivations. The wealthy landowner wasn't really interested in sustainable agriculture or long-term environmental stewardship, but rather saw waterkeeper techniques as a way to make desert land profitable quickly, regardless of whether such use could be maintained over generations. The clarity of this rejection actually simplified Sam's decision-making. confirming that his primary responsibility was to the teachings themselves and the communities they were meant to serve rather than to the economic opportunities they might create. The network of teaching gardens that Sam helped establish over the following years demonstrated that sustainable desert agriculture could spread without being compromised by commercial exploitation. Working with both settler families who were genuinely committed to learning better approaches and native communities who were willing to share knowledge with respectful outsiders, Sam created a model for cultural exchange that benefited everyone involved. The gardens became gathering places where people learned not just agricultural techniques, but also broader lessons about cooperation, respect for different knowledge systems, and the possibility of building communities that honored both tradition and adaptation. Kelly eventually returned to his community to continue his waterkeeper training. But his year with the Porter family had established bonds that continued long after his departure. He visited regularly, bringing new knowledge from other waterkeepers and learning how the teaching gardens were evolving as they adapted to different local conditions. The mark on his arm had come to represent not just his identity as a waterkeeper apprentice, but also his role in creating a bridge that allowed sacred knowledge to serve new communities while maintaining the ethical commitments that made that knowledge worth preserving. As Sam stood in his teaching garden, on a warm afternoon 5 years after finding Kayleigh by his irrigation ditch, watching a mixed group of settler farmers and native families discussing soil composition and seasonal planting cycles, he reflected on how profoundly his life had changed through a simple act of compassion for an injured child. The mark on Kayleigh's arm that he'd noticed while bandaging the boy's leg had indeed meant his life would never be the same. But the transformation had been far richer and more meaningful than simple agricultural success. Sam had learned that knowledge was most powerful when it served communities rather than individuals, that wisdom from different traditions could enrich each other when approached with respect and humility, and that sometimes the most important contribution a person could make was simply creating space for understanding to develop between people who had been taught to see each other as competitors or enemies. The desert that had nearly defeated his farming efforts was now his teacher, and the lessons it offered through waterkeeper traditions had shown him that success measured in harvests was less important than success measured in relationships built, knowledge preserved, and communities strengthened through shared understanding of how to live well in challenging environments. Emma had become a teacher in her own right, particularly skilled at helping settler women understand how to use native plants for food, medicine, and household materials. Her practical demonstrations showed that the waterkeeper traditions weren't just abstract environmental philosophy, but rather offered concrete solutions to daily challenges that frontier families faced. The Porter children, now 11-year-old Martha and 9-year-old James, represented a new generation that had been raised with respect for multiple knowledge systems and could move easily between settler and native communities, serving as translators not just of language, but of cultural assumptions and values. The teaching gardens had spread beyond southern Arizona, with Sam receiving requests from communities throughout the Southwest, asking for guidance in establishing similar programs. He couldn't personally visit all these locations, but he'd trained a network of teachers who understood both the practical techniques and the ethical framework that made the waterkeeper approach valuable. These teachers included both settlers who had learned from Sam and native waterkeepers, who had recognized the value of sharing knowledge with outsiders who would honor it properly, the territorial authorities who had initially been skeptical about Sam's methods eventually recognized that the teaching gardens were producing results that addressed serious agricultural challenges facing Arizona settlement. Several government officials visited the Porter farm and came away impressed not just by the crop yields, but by the cooperation between different communities that the teaching garden model facilitated. Some of these officials began advocating for policies that would protect native knowledge systems and create incentives for sustainable agricultural practices, rather than simply encouraging maximum short-term exploitation of desert resources. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of Sam's work came from waterkeeper elders who visited his farm to evaluate whether the knowledge Kayleigh had shared was being honored appropriately. These visits were formal ceremonies that involved careful observation of how the teaching gardens operated, conversations with both settler and native participants, and assessment of whether the sacred principles underlying Waterkeeper traditions were being maintained despite the cultural translation required to make them accessible to outsiders. The elder who had the most impact on Sam was a woman named Tyanita, who carried the same mark Keeley bore, but with additional symbols indicating her status as a master waterkeeper. Her evaluation of Sam's teaching garden was thorough and uncompromising, looking beyond surface agricultural success to examine whether the deeper wisdom about relationship with land was being transmitted. When she finally spoke her judgment, delivered in careful English honed through years of serving as a bridge between communities, her words brought tears to Sam's eyes. "You have honored the mark," Tyanita said, touching Keeley's arm gently while looking at Sam. "Not by claiming to become a waterkeeper yourself, which would have been presumption, but by serving as a faithful translator of principles. You understand to be sacred, even though they come from traditions not originally your own. The teaching gardens carry waterkeeper wisdom forward while allowing it to adapt to new circumstances, which is exactly what our traditions have always done when faced with changing conditions. You have shown that knowledge can be shared without being diminished, that different peoples can learn from each other without one having to surrender their distinct identity." Tyanita's blessing of Sam's work opened doors that had previously remained closed, with more native communities becoming willing to participate in teaching garden programs and share knowledge that had been carefully guarded during periods when such sharing would have led to exploitation. The network of cooperation that developed represented an unprecedented level of cultural exchange, made possible because people on both sides recognized that their long-term interests were better served by sharing knowledge about sustainable practices than by maintaining barriers that left everyone struggling with desert agriculture. The challenges didn't disappear entirely, as there remained settlers who preferred exploitative approaches that maximized short-term profits, and native people who viewed any sharing of traditional knowledge with outsiders as dangerous cultural compromise. But the teaching gardens provided visible evidence that another path was possible, one that honored both the practical need for productive agriculture and the ethical imperative to maintain sustainable relationships with the land that supported human communities. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in the brilliant colors that never ceased to move Sam even after years of witnessing desert sunsets, Kelly arrived at the farm for one of his regular visits. The boy had grown into a young man now, his training as a waterkeeper advancing to levels that few of his generation achieved. The mark on his arm remained as distinctive as ever, but it was now complemented by additional symbols, indicating knowledge gained and responsibilities accepted. The two of them walked through the teaching garden together, Kaylee pointing out subtle details that Sam would have missed even after years of studying waterkeeper principles. A particular plant growing in an unexpected location, indicating underground water movement that could be useful to know. A pattern in how insects were clustering, suggesting weather changes that would affect planting decisions. The behavior of birds that revealed information about seasonal transitions. The education continued even now, because waterkeeper knowledge was not something that could be fully mastered, but rather represented a lifelong journey of deepening understanding. "My teachers asked me to tell you something," Kaylee said as they reached the oldest section of the teaching garden, where Sam had first implemented the improvements that had saved his farm. "They want you to know that while you will never carry the mark of a waterkeeper, because that is reserved for those born and raised within our traditions, you have earned something perhaps equally important. You have become what we call a bridge person, someone who can stand between different worlds and help knowledge flow in directions it could not travel through traditional paths alone." Sam felt the weight of this recognition, understanding it as both honor and continued responsibility. The mark on Kaylee's arm had transformed his life, but not through any magic or supernatural power. It had done so by representing a doorway into understanding that the desert he'd been trying to conquer was actually willing to be a partner if approached with respect and wisdom. The injured boy he'd helped by his irrigation ditch had carried knowledge that could change not just individual farms, but entire communities' relationships with the challenging environment they called home. I found you by my irrigation ditch because I was trying to reach the water I knew was there, Kayla continued, his English now fluent and philosophical in ways that showed both his traditional training and his years of bridging cultures. But in helping me, you found a different kind of water, the knowledge that flows through generations when people choose to preserve and share it. My leg healed because of your care, but your understanding healed because you were willing to see that a child from a different culture might have something valuable to teach. That willingness is what the mark represents, not just for waterkeepers, but for anyone who chooses to be a student of the world, rather than trying to be its master. As darkness settled over the Arizona desert and the teaching garden became a collection of shadows under emerging stars, Sam and Keely sat together in companionable silence, two people from different worlds who had found common ground in wisdom about water, soil, seasons, and the delicate balance required to sustain life in unforgiving places. The mark on Kaylee's arm was no longer mysterious to Sam, but rather had become a symbol he understood deeply, representing knowledge preserved through generations, adapted to changing circumstances, and shared with those who would honor it properly. Sam's life had indeed never been the same after finding that limping native boy and discovering the sacred mark, but the changes had been far more profound than he could have imagined that day, when he'd simply acted on the compassionate impulse to help a child in need. He'd discovered that true wealth lay not in accumulating resources, but in understanding how to sustain them. That wisdom came from listening to those who had learned from the land over generations, and that building bridges between different ways of knowing created possibilities that isolation and suspicion could never produce. The teaching garden that surrounded them represented seeds of a different kind than the crops it grew, seeds of understanding, respect, and cooperation that were taking root in communities across the territory and beyond. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that Sam had learned through that mark on a young boy's arm, that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from conquering nature or dominating others, but from being humble enough to recognize when someone else, even a child from a culture you don't fully understand, might hold knowledge that could change your life, your community, and your relationship with the world that sustains you all.